Welcome. I came in a cab and I left my wallet in the cab. So I'm very excited to see Finlandia vodka. Welcome to the Ambassadors Insider Series, Finland and the EU. We've been doing this for about 3 years. They've been popular events. It's a nice mix of networking and substance. So we thank you for coming. Ambassador Kirsti, Kauppi of Finland, thank you for joining us. And also Ambassador Stavros, Lambrinidis, the EU. This should be an interesting event. Also want to acknowledge and welcome Ambassador of the Arab League, Ambassador Salah Sarhan, and Ambassador Pejir Simonovic of Croatia. Thank you for joining us. I think we have Mrs. Universe of Ireland coming too. Hey, hey! That should be a nice little treat. Yes, I'm sorry. And she's competing on December 8th in Atlanta. So she's preparing herself. We got to support her. On December 5th, we will host another Ambassador Insider Series, Women in Diplomacy. We'll be the Ambassador of Honduras, Ambassador of who are those two? Albania. Iceland. Fantastic. Thanks for the help. I want to thank our sponsors. We have sponsors that support our series, which is DC United and Savory Insurance. So I'm going to turn it over to Anna. Anybody that knows Anna is our managing editor. She moderates global education conferences and several of these events. It's a tough job knowing the world, and she knows it well. So Anna, take it over.
Thank you, Victor. I hope you find your wallet. So I'm going to keep my introduction uncharacteristically somewhat brief, since we have two ambassadors on the stage with us tonight. But first, I do want to extend a special thank you to both, since this is now the second time they've agreed to sit and be grilled by me, and so I certainly appreciate that, though maybe I should be harder on you because you so readily agreed. I don't know, but hopefully not. We'll see. But on that note, as some of you may know, I profiled both ambassadors on our June and July issues. And now you might think that with several thousand words apiece, those articles would pretty much tell you everything you'd ever need to know about the EU and Finland. But you don't know me. There's always something more to write and talk about. But in fact, of course, every area that we covered in those interviews, from Iran and trade to China, climate change and immigration, are as timely as ever and as rapidly changing as ever. Now, some of you might have heard or read about, apparently there are some hearings taking place downtown on Capitol Hill. I know the media has really been downplaying it, and they've definitely been on the same page when it comes to covering everything. But in all seriousness, obviously our Beltway bandwidth has been consumed by the Trump impeachment inquiry. But elsewhere, the world goes on, and there has been a whole lot going on for us to talk about. So on that note, I want to dive straight in, and Ambassador Lambrinidis, I would like to start with you. The last time we spoke, you said that EU-US relations had turned a corner. It's been well over 6 months now. Things in Washington are as chaotic as ever. So how would you describe the current state of transatlantic ties under President Trump, both diplomatically and economically, when it comes to the trade front, which seems to have quieted down on your end lately?
Yes, thank you. I think that's true. When last we spoke, the trade front was a little hotter than it is today. That heat has not disappeared entirely. But I think what I see increasingly in discussion with the administration, Congress, and others is a increasingly great understanding of how dramatically positive trade relationship has been for our people in Europe and for Americans here. We've been doing a lot of explaining of things that sound very esoteric, like what is a single market in Europe. But when you actually look into what that means, you realize that in fact Europe has been the biggest deregulation experiment in the world, as opposed to the impression some people have with this terrible bureaucracy or regulatory authority. We got rid of 28 different independent countries' laws and regulations, and we replaced them with only one, and we created in the process the biggest, most open market in the world. We are creating 15 million jobs across the Atlantic every year with our trade and investment. 45 of the 50 US states trade with Europe more than they do with anyone else in the world. And I think that these facts, as boring as numbers sometimes sound, in fact are penetrating the surface now. And people are understanding that this is not a relationship to be vilifying, it's a relationship to be celebrating. When it comes to the broader scene, all I will say is that in Europe we are about to have a new commission. And what you have seen in the past few months is an effort on both sides of the Atlantic to anticipate the new commission coming in, to ensure that transatlantic relations remain on a positive note, given this transition, and to begin having already meetings between US politicians. Mike Pompeo was in September in Brussels, meeting with the appointed new president of the Commission, the Council, the new High Representative for Foreign Security Policy, the President of the Parliament. So this has been a very good window of opportunity to step back, think about all that is coming ahead, and think of the positives. So I remain positive, but of course I'm not naive. I know the difficulties, and we work together every day together with our member states as well to address them.
So on that note, I just want to follow up on the specifics of the trade talks. I was just reading today that the president's own self-imposed deadline on using national security as a basis to impose tariffs on foreign-made cars just lapsed a week ago. So that's going to tie his hands legally. He has delayed imposing tariffs on car and auto parts from the EU. And it doesn't seem like formal talks have quite begun because there are some holdups over the scope of those discussions. So can you get into more specifics of where we are in terms of addressing some of the main trade disputes involving the auto sector and also America's push for greater access to the EU's agricultural sector?
Sure. So when you look at the auto sector, indeed the 6 months set by that process, which termed, in our view, not rationally, imports of cars as a national security threat, has in fact expired. The process of potentially discussing and continuing to discuss is still there. So my understanding is that the administration has a number of options, but the option of continuing to discuss with us is still on the table, and we are working on that assumption. It would be a terrible mistake to have a trade war on cars. It would be much bigger and much more harmful, both for the US economy and for the EU economy, than the one that we've had on aluminum and steel. So another part of the discussion we're having now with the administration is the importance of finding a way to lift finally those aluminum and steel tariffs against EU steel on the basis on the argument that it is a national security threat. So we can too immediately at the same time lift all the countervailing measures that we have to impose on US products. We're also discussing, and we're quite advanced on discussing things that are very important to companies, such as conformity assessments. Today, if you create a product in the US, it needs to get a conformity assessment from an EU body that it conforms with EU standards and vice versa. Managing to get rid of that, ensuring that you can have US bodies, competent bodies do the work and vice versa for American products, would save millions and millions of dollars to exporters and to traders. And this is the kind of thing that I hope we're very close to addressing. More broadly, industrial tariffs, in which cars also fall. We have like an agreement, the two presidents last July, to try to negotiate dealing with them. We are ready to eliminate them. Take all industrial products, bring down tariffs to as close to zero as we can tomorrow. We are ready to negotiate, and I have to say, I would hope that the U.S. is would be more excited about that prospect. Indeed, they haven't been, because they say, well, we also have to discuss agriculture, which was your question, right? Well, the agriculture is a very politically sensitive issue here, which is why the U.S. is raising it. It's also a politically sensitive issue in Europe, which is why the two presidents decided explicitly not to include it in what they were trying to achieve. But having said that, we have been working on agriculture in the past year very effectively. more than 120% increase on soybeans from the US to the EU, after they were also certified as a product that was okay to use for biofuels. That is huge profits into US farmers' pockets. We also, last August, signed a new deal with the US on hormone-free beef imports to the EU. I had the honor of being in the White House with the President, with Bob Lighthizer, with the presidency, but unfortunately not with Kirsti. Kirsti was on holiday, and signed together, and also with about 20 or 30 US cattle ranchers who were all wearing this beautiful cowboy hats that looked exactly the same to me. So I don't know where they got them. But in the end, I told the president, I said, hey, I'd like a hat. And then one of the ranchers jumped in and said, you have not earned it yet, sir. You have not earned it yet. So I said, okay. I thought I had, but okay. But you know, so there's real progress on a number of agricultural issues, even if we actually, yes, decided, the president not discuss the full thing. And let me end with this on agriculture, because I think it's important, and I want everyone here to know it. We discussed it with Kirsti last time we were here. You don't hear the EU complaining about the US that much. You hear more sometimes some in the US complaining about the EU trade. The EU is by far the most open market in the world, together with the US, which is why, as I told you before, American companies invest and trade with the EU more than they do with anyone else, because they can. At the same time, we have issues. If you try to go out here anywhere in DC, and you try to buy an apple that comes from Europe, you will see that you will not find an apple that comes from Europe. All imports of apples and pears from Europe are banned in the US. You wonder why? Well, there was maybe 10 years ago some phytosanitary concern, and since then every single test that the US has to ensure that products coming from abroad are safe has been taken and passed. And now there's a decision for a long time on the desk of the Secretary of Agriculture to sign it, and he won't. Now, that's bad enough. But think this. When Russia invaded Crimea, we imposed sanctions. We, meaning you in the US, we in Europe, 28 of our member states unanimously imposed harsh sanctions on Russia. And Russia was very upset by this, and it decided it was going to try to punish EU member states for doing that. And one of the things Russia chose to do was to ban the imports of apples into Russia from a number of EU countries, including countries that are huge producers, such as Poland. I can assure you that Poland would be more than happy not to feel blackmailed by Russia if it had an open market for apples and pears in the United States to be diverting its exports to, and it couldn't. So if I tell you an apple a day keeps Putin away, you get it, right? You get it. It's a very complex relationship, Anna, and it's a relationship that we have to be working on. We have disagreements. But major allies and the two biggest economies in the world don't bicker with each other. They sit down and resolve them, because what is at stake is much bigger than the few things we disagree on.
But that's a good line. Is that the first time you've used it, or have you used it before?
I've used it the last time I was here at the Finnish Embassy, so
okay.
I think this place inspires me.
Well, Finland, of course, knows quite a bit about Russia and the difficulties of balancing Russia in the West. But for those that don't know, Finland is wrapping up its 6-month presidency of the EU, a role that is not quite as influential as it once was, but is still important in promoting various EU policies. The last time the ambassador and I spoke, you had mentioned that Finland would be focusing on areas such as growth, security, and climate. So now that you're nearing the end of the presidency, can you tell us more about what Finland was able to accomplish, and especially in regards to climate change?
Yes, thank you. Well, we still have about 1.5 months to go, so we hope to close the file on several important issues, which include enlargement, the multi-year financial framework, which sounds a little bit bureaucratic, but which is very important. That's the huge EU budget and the decision on what are the priorities as far as our investments are concerned. So far, I think since our presidency of the Council of the European Union takes place in a period of transition, like Stavros mentioned, we don't have the new Commission in place yet. So it's a little bit of a different period in comparison to a normal presidency. So as far as pursuing legislation, which is the bread and butter of the European Union, very forcefully, that is a little bit more difficult at the time, but we have tried to take the files further that are on the table now, and they relate very much to the single market that that Stavros mentioned. So as far as the other big issues are concerned, during our presidency, we have concentrated a lot on climate issues, and we still hope that we will be able to agree between the member states on a very ambitious long-term climate action plan, which would entail the objective of being basically carbon neutral by 2050. It's not very simple because all the different member states have a very different situation, but we are hopeful that we would get there. Another file that is still open, as I mentioned, is the enlargement, which is very important politically. I hope we will be able to close it before we hand off the gavel to Croatia. And many other things. What we have done, since this is a transition period, is to introduce several policy discussions. You know, the heads of state as well as the ministers often concentrate on the agenda at hand, and we sometimes sort of feel that we lose the opportunity to address the longer term issues. And so we have been using this time a lot as in introducing that kind of longer term brainstorming sessions into the work of the Council, where we have also studied the connections between different issues like economy and growth, social justice and economy, social justice and climate, economy and climate. So that's one thing that we have been doing. As far as climate is concerned, in the EU, we, like in Finland as well, we see the climate issue as something that is really present in all the different files. It's a cross-cutting issue. It's about how do you transform your economy, how do you transform your transport sector, energy sector, and so on and so forth. So it's a very broad agenda.
Right. And now on that note, just to follow up, as many of you know, the annual UN Climate Summit is coming up in a few weeks, and as we all know, a year from now, the US can formally exit the Paris Climate Accord unless a new president decides to stay in it. Unfortunately, all of the latest figures show we are way behind on achieving the Paris goal of holding eventual warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So it can be a disheartening picture. At the same time, what I wanted to point out is the embassy here, locally, which has twice been awarded the LEED designation. Congratulations. Platinum LEED. Platinum. And has been taking some interesting initiatives to promote sustainability in diplomatic missions, both here and abroad. So can you tell us, on one hand, some of these local initiatives that the embassy is pursuing, and also then globally, what does it mean for morale and the commitments of other countries at the climate change summit to go forward without the US, the only country that's not in it?
Well, obviously the fact that when the US is not anymore in the Paris Agreement, that takes away a lot from the global momentum as far as climate action is concerned. But we are hopeful that the US continues certain policies, and like the present administration has said, the US concentrates very much on technology and innovation, and that is good. What is also happening in the US, and which also has a broader, global impact, is the fact that the sub-federal entities are very much engaged. As you know, many of the states pursue a very progressive climate policy, as do many of the cities. I think Stavros remembers the numbers better than me. But that is very impressive, and that sort of compensates a little bit this impact that is felt in the global scene when the US withdraws from the Paris Agreement. I mean, in a sense, it's very impressive to see that the cities and the states then take the lead. So we are hopeful in that respect, and we are also hopeful that at some point the US will return to the Paris Agreement, because the significance of the Paris Agreement is exactly in building this global momentum. Now there are countries and many countries which are not doing their share, but it is possible to sort of, as I said, encourage, but also have peer pressure for everybody to do their share. So I think we, as far as the COP25 is concerned, which will be held in Madrid, in Spain, instead of Chile, but it will still be a summit chaired by Chile. There, certain concrete steps will be a sort of a rule book, will be hopefully agreed upon, hopefully, and all the other major economies will be present. Also, the US will be actually present, but of course constrained by this decision by the administration to withdraw. And also issues related to climate action financing will be on the table. And we are optimistic that good results will come out of the summit. EU is actually at the moment the global leader in climate action, and we emphasize that very much. I would like to mention one concrete thing that is not related to the EU, but again, something that demonstrates the fact that you need leaders. Chile and Finland established about 1.5 years ago a climate action coalition of the finance ministers. And everybody can understand how key the finance ministers are when you are thinking about incentives and taxation and so on. But finally, I think in the climate issues, the public opinion is turning towards appreciating the fact that this is the biggest challenge we are all facing, and nobody can escape the responsibility they have, and we can only tackle it together.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as you said, when you have states like California and corporations like Amazon pledging to hit certain targets, that all adds up to what certain countries equals to their own targets. So, but Ambassador, coming back to you, you had mentioned enlargement, and I know recently French President Emmanuel Macron vetoed discussions on North Macedonia joining the EU, arguing that members need to rethink whether it's in the bloc's best interest to enlarge. Obviously, this was a huge blow to Balkan nations, North Macedonia, Albania, Serbia. So what are your thoughts on this veto and the French president's argument that expansion is not in the bloc's best interest at the moment?
Well, first of all, every European Union institution, except for the Council, as you said, with the French presidents expressing some reservations, has very openly recommended and asked the prime ministers to open the accession negotiations. There was even a letter sent by the present president of the European Commission and the future one, and the present president of the European Council, the future one, asking that member states make that unanimous decision. It needs to be unanimous. The issue is, of course, not over. The discussion is going on, and there will be a new discussion by the middle of next year, in which there will be a new decision taken. There is no question that until all countries in the Western Balkans regions embark officially on their European membership perspective, and my prediction is that they will, sooner or later, there's no question, that the European Union is the biggest supporter of their economic development, of the changes their people wish to make in their governance structures, in their courts, in their economies. And so, whatever label you wish to put on it, the process of actual integration has begun, and it is very effective and successful. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. The only thing I would say there is the following, because this is an issue, of course, that concerns us, and we hear a lot and we discuss a lot with our U.S. friends about it. I am pleased that the U.S. recognizes, in this particular case, the tremendous importance of a strong, united, and rich European Union. Because indeed, it is only such an EU that can continue serving as the main attraction for all these countries in the region to eventually become members of it and make all the reforms necessary to be full members of it. It is, in that sense, I think, a very positive note that the United States is encouraging a strong and united EU to serve as a beacon there. Because, of course, we know that there are other countries around the world that are more than ready to go in the region. They already are, very often, with a simple argument, which they're using often, trying to present that the EU and the US are not on the same page, trying to tell those countries that what kind of an EU do you want to enter? Why don't you just stay with us? Don't trust them. We'll just play with your system. We'll give you cheap money. We'll control your economies, your politics, and that's not okay. So it is, in fact, a strong and united EU that is the only solution to those dangers, and I'm pleased that we are that. We're going to get to a decision, but look, what I don't want anyone here to think, it's the same thing, I suppose, has been a discussion in the US in the past, when it comes to looking at how far do you go with integration in the EU today. It is very important to take into account the fact that the European Union is going through a very important phase of deepening and strengthening its structures. So, irrespective entirely of this discussion, I'm not connecting the two, the EU under the new Commission has already discussed the great importance of expanding economic integration, creating a banking union, creating a capital markets union, all those things that will fortify the euro as an incredibly strong European and world currency, providing stability in financial markets. All those things take a lot of work, a lot of sacrifice, a lot of changes within the EU member states itself, as they are. So you always will hear, and please do not overemphasize the significance of it, many of us focus as well on the importance of deepening the European Union at the same time that we attach importance on enlarging it.
Mm-hmm. Now, just to follow up very briefly, in terms of EU unity, one of the biggest tests of it was the 2015 refugee crisis, which has faded from the headlines, but there are certainly signs that the EU could face another influx of refugees. Your own homeland of Greece has recently experienced the biggest surge of arrivals since 2015. We have Turkish President Erdogan, who has threatened to pulled back on the agreement that sharply curtailed the number of refugees from Turkey that were coming to Europe if the EU does not provide more financial assistance, and also if EU leaders dispute his plans to expand Turkish influence in northern Syria. So, Ambassador, what is the EU's response to the Turkish president's demands, and what is it also doing to prevent another refugee crisis from taking over?
Well, let's talk about the refugee situation today. Turkey has indeed a huge burden, about 3 million refugees from Syria. And we as Europeans are by far the biggest supporters of all the infrastructure required in Turkey to be able to provide as decent as possible a condition of living for these refugees. We have pledged and given 6 billion euros already in the past 2.5 years. Money that doesn't go directly to the Turkish government, money that in a vast majority goes to UN agencies that are creating the camps that exist, and also directly, mind you, to the refugees themselves through cash cards that they can use then to purchase their needs directly from the Turkish economy. It is an infusion of cash of the EU, not just supporting the refugees themselves, but also supporting dramatically the Turkish economy around those camps. I don't believe that anyone in Turkey is denying that great contribution, and in fact, it's an evolving situation. Europe, I am sure, will keep looking at the needs and keep adjusting its support to ensure that many of those needs are met. When it comes to, and indeed sometimes you hear threats of opening the floodgates, that would be a very big mistake. I do not believe that Turkey, which is a candidate country, would find it in its interest to move down that path. And also when you look at the discussions of returning refugees in Turkey today to Syria, the answer of the European Union is extremely clear. Absolutely, yes, returns on a voluntary basis in conditions where people can live decently, can have the rights protected, in conditions that do not demographically alter the composition of the population in Syria. Because in fact, if you bring people in places in which they were not born and they didn't live, in Syria, you are guaranteeing new bloodshed, new ethnic hatred, new fighting, which would be absolutely not in the interest of Turkey, certainly not of Europe, and certainly not of the United States. So what we've said there very clear is, if we're talking about returns, forced returns, to affecting the demographic composition of Syria and also not respecting the rights of migrants, we will not be able to support in any way those things. We will support, as we do today, humanitarian aid, especially in northeastern Turkey, but unfortunately what the Turkish invasion in Syria did, among the many other very negative things that it has, including the great risk that we have today for a resurgence of ISIS and ISIS pockets, is that it has made it very difficult for us to be able to provide a humanitarian aid just because it's dangerous. So we have asked Turkey to withdraw the forces from there, and we have asked for a relative normalcy to return. There are discussions now, for the first time, on the constitution of Syria that are taking place outside of Syria, something that the European Union has worked very hard for. We are supporting that extremely forcefully. We are hoping that we will be able, through our persuasion and through the prospect of our huge support to the country, to finally get a political solution that works and that includes everyone and that protects everyone's rights. And if we get there, that's going to be a good thing. Guns are not going to do it. Guns are not going to do it.
Ambassador, switching over, Finland was one of the EU countries that absorbed a very large number of asylum seekers in 2015, and is still in the process of integrating them. This gets to the related issue of immigration, which we all have talked about, but I would like to talk about a less commonly examined aspect of immigration, which is the need for new workers to offset the demographic challenges that countries like Finland and our own country face. It's an issue that's often overlooked, but is hugely consequential. Some countries are going to face a massive youth bulge, such as those in the Middle East, while others, such as yours and ours, will be dealing with an increasingly aging population. And I think it's interesting, given that Finland offers such a generous social safety net, how is the government going to balance this and approaching this dilemma of caring for an increasingly older population while still providing these benefits?
Well, that's the $1,000 question, 1 million question, 1 billion question. I think what we need, first of all, we do need immigration. We also need people to work longer. And we have in place several policies, especially as far as the latter one is concerned, how to combine the possibility of working longer and still, enjoying your senior years. What we are also trying to do is to look at this very a good safety net that we have, and the safety net is interesting, I think, for especially in this country. In most European countries, we have the safety net means that you have either free or very affordable public services, education, healthcare, and so on. That's part of what we call the safety net. Everybody has access to affordable healthcare, education, and other services. The additional aspect is what's usually the meaning of the words here, for instance, in the States, is that if you lose your job or you face another adversity in your life, you need assistance, you need social security. But our system, which is excellent, is too complicated. It's inefficient in the sense that it consists of very many different elements. The public services, that's one area we need to reform them, but then this sort of really the social safety net in the sense that it is meant here in the States. We need to reform it. And we are trying to look at how to reform it through different means. One of the means is that we experimented with something like universal basic income to see if something as simple as that, giving basic income to a certain group of population would be sufficient to compensate for the safety net. Simple enough, and actually also functioning more as an incentive. Exactly what I said, we need to work longer, we need to increase the employment participation in the workforce and so on. And this experiment was done, the results were a little bit not as good as we hoped for, but I think this is the avenue we have to go. Simplify the social safety net so that it is also cheaper in a sense, but also in such a fashion that it incentivizes not only the seniors to continue working, but also the younger generations who are facing this totally new work environment, where you have to just, switch from one job to another all the time. It doesn't give you a living wage. So we need new kinds of solutions, both to the challenge of the aging population and how to take care, but also to how do we afford a strong sort of system, how can we afford a strong system in the society that functions as security, but also as an incentive for everybody to contribute to the society.
Right. Well, I think that's really interesting to challenge the narrative that we have here in the U.S. of the Nordic countries as this, utopia, paradise, and it just goes to show how so many of these dilemmas, even though they're different systems, are quite universal. So I know the ambassador is on a tight schedule, so I want to make sure we have time for a few questions. So if we do, there'll be a microphone coming around, and if you have a question, please, if you could briefly state it. Because if not, I'll just keep talking.
May I say something?
Sure, of course.
First of all, don't start doubting in front of the ambassador that the Nordic countries are a paradise, because in addition to her building, she'll start telling you how they're the happiest people in the world.
I know, I was going to mention that. Yeah.
I'm just saying.
For
I'm just
2
saying.
or 3 times.
Which is true. Which is true. The only thing I would say is, because I think what Kirsti said is in fact extremely inspiring, because you see the process that in Europe we try to deal also on a governmental level, anticipating the big crisis of the future, social crisis. We don't just simply allow the markets or luck to resolve them. We try to develop policies that ensure that we can both have remarkably competitive economies, but also that we take care of those who fall behind. And I think what is an interesting example here for you to maybe take into account, and I've been trying also to, when I talk to my US interlocutors, to encourage more contacts between us to discuss is healthcare. So healthcare here is a big issue, and sometimes it gets very politically controversial. In Europe, it's not controversial. We have healthcare covering all our populations. Now you might think, okay, so of course, you're just throwing all this money, creating a nanny state, throwing all this money on your people, and that's not the way to work it. And the answer is, okay, let's look at the facts. In Europe, it costs our governments about $10,000 per person in order to provide health coverage to everyone in the European Union. In the US, it costs the US government about $15,000 per person to provide health coverage not to every citizen in the United States. Isn't that interesting? You probably wouldn't have thought that would be the case. We have a remarkable amount of experience, of making sure that we don't throw our money away, that we actually create a social safety net, but also do so efficiently, or as efficiently as possibly we can. And the reason we have it is because we have tried and failed and tried and failed in the same way that Finland is trying and failing and trying and succeeding eventually in finding a model to work. This is a constant process. And I think we are quite proud as Europeans that we engage in it.
Well, of course, healthcare is going to be one of the main issues, and it continues to be. I remember when I immigrated here from Poland, and that was the first thing my parents pointed out, that if you don't have healthcare and there's a broken leg, you could be bankrupt. So we certainly have our share of trying to come, and that's going to be one of many, many, many issues to be discussed. So on that note, if there are any other issues that somebody would like to bring up, Tony, yes.
Mr. Ambassador, there's an 800-pound gorilla in your room at the moment. It's called the United Kingdom. So could you give us a little bit in terms of a current overview about the ramifications for Brexit, not only for the UK, but particularly with regard to, as you can hear from my speech impediment, I'm from Derry in Northern Ireland, and also a family in Donegal, the Republic of Ireland. Where are the borders going to go? What is actually happening? What are the ramifications going to be for the EU if the UK does leave in January? What are the ramifications going to be for the people of Ireland, North and South, in terms of the maintenance of the border?
Very quickly. There will be no border in Ireland if the UK leaves by voting for the withdrawal agreement that has been negotiated, because we in the European Union made extremely clear that we will never accept any Brexit deal unless it guaranteed that there would be no border in Ireland. We made it very clear we could not accept any Brexit deal if it violated the integrity of the single market, the biggest economic achievement of the EU in the past decades. And we made it very clear that we would not accept it if a deal requested by the UK violated the Good Friday Agreement in any way. And this is what was achieved in the slightly renegotiated withdrawal agreement. And we were honestly sad to see that it didn't pass. Now, yet the UK now has an election. The withdrawal agreement and its passage is going to be the guarantee that there can be an orderly Brexit. That will be very hurtful for the UK, of course, hurtful for us as well, but at least it will be orderly. The alternative of a hard Brexit, of a Brexit without an agreement, will be an immediate and a devastating hit on the UK's economy. The UK's political system is already quite hit. For those following the UK over the past years, they cannot believe their eyes in what they're seeing today in terms of the ability of the country, or the inability to come together and discuss those issues without a tremendous amount of polarization and other things. So that's what it is. We didn't want the UK to leave. We didn't ask it to leave. We did not interpret a non-binding referendum where a very small percentage of people said they wanted to leave as if it were a binding one that obligated us to get out. That's all stuff that happened in the UK. But the process has gone on. I often say that we went through phases. The phases of, what is it, of mourning or something like that. You know, initially you deny. You know, they couldn't have voted this way, could they? It's crazy. Then you kind of get angry. What are they doing? Then you negotiate. Well, you know, we did that too. Then eventually you accept. We have accepted the decision of the UK to leave. We're entirely prepared in the EU for all scenarios, for a hard Brexit and for a soft Brexit. And we've given every option and every opportunity, and we still are working hard to ensure that the UK can reach a decision for an orderly Brexit, which would be the best solution under the circumstances for the UK and for the EU as well.
I just want to add that then, of course, we start to negotiate the future relationship, which is a very important phase. And I think that will be as equally important as the present phase. What will be the future relationship?
Thank you, Tony. That was my last question, actually, but I wasn't sure if we were running out of time.
If
There you go. Great point.
If all goes well in terms of the timing, as predicted now, I don't want to say what well is, but let's say the timing, then the future relationship discussions will fall on the shoulders of? Yes.
Hopefully not.
So we have time for one more question over there, yeah, or two more. Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, Madam Ambassador, thank you very much for your insightful comments. I was curious if you could elaborate a little bit about Nord Stream 2. There's growing momentum in Congress to pass additional sanctions within member states as a divisive issues. What are your thoughts? And do you have any comments about Richard Grinnell, the new U.S. Special Envoy to Kosovo? Thank you. And the Kosovo-Serbia dispute.
Well, maybe I'll start with the Nord Stream 2 in the sense, not so much actually about Nord Stream 2, but something that is often overlooked here in the States, and that is how much the EU has done as far as building up energy security and diversification in Europe. And that is the big story. So we have built a lot of new pipelines and connectors and really increased the diversification considerably. And the energy security of the European Union and individual member states in many senses has increased considerably. So I think that's a very important aspect that has to be kept in mind.
Yes, I think this is the main point that Ambassador Gawel made. If you look at the facts in the past year, that's also a result of the trade discussions between the two presidents in July. There's been an almost 400% increase of LNG imports from the US to the European Union. This didn't just happen. It happened because we have invested billions, the EU and our member states, exactly on what Kirsti said, on LNG terminals that can take the LNG and diversify it, and also on interconnectors that can take it from one place and take it to other places. This is, in fact, the appropriate approach in dealing with this issue. Extraterritorial applications of sanctions by the United States in a number of areas is something that the European Union has very openly condemned. We believe they are illegal under international law. But the issue here is much more interesting and geopolitical. We have to in Europe, we want to in Europe, we have been doing this for years, diversify both our energy sources and energy supply routes and suppliers. This is the way that you ensure that no one can ever be big enough to be able to in any way blackmail, quote unquote, as the argument would go, any European Union country. And we're being very effective in this. And also with our laws, we're ensuring that every pipeline, whether it's Nord Stream 2 or any other one, cannot function unless it falls under EU law, which means that you cannot be going out there and being both a supplier of the gas and an operator of the pipeline. You have to allow other sources to come in. All these EU laws as well ensure, to a great extent, greater diversification. So I am telling you this to give the general picture. The European Union itself is not engaged directly in this debate. All these issues are issues that involve member states are the ones that have to address primarily. But just to give you the European context to understand how the best way, in our view, for this issue to be addressed is.
One more point, and that is on sanctions policy. In order for the sanctions policy to be effective, we need transatlantic unity. So that's, I think, very important.
I think we have time for one very brief question, Ambassador. I understand. Well, Ambassador, please, yes.
Thank you. I'm Ambassador Sarhan, Ambassador of Arab League in Washington. I have a very light question to Madam Ambassador, Finnish Ambassador. Just tell me, what is the secrets behind the Finnish people there? Say something bizarre. Just tell me, no challenges, nothing in your board? Thank you, Madam Ambassador.
How do you do? How are you so happy?
We are not really as happy. We are content. Oh, I suppose our expectations are sort of reasonable. And I think one secret, real secret, is that we are very close to the nature. So you get, I mean, whatever happens in your own life, you put it in perspective when you are in the nature.
And we have lots of nature here, and we've heard about the embassy. It's a beautiful embassy. So I wanted to thank both ambassadors. Of course, thank everybody for coming. We have one more AIS, as Victor mentioned, on December 5th. I should know that. But please stick around. We have food, we have drink, and networking. So thank you again, everyone, for coming. Yes.
I think both on behalf of Kirsti and me, let me thank the Washington Diplomat and you too, because not just because you interviewed us at some point, but because you're increasing your outreach in the city, and because you're touching also on some of the most interesting political foreign policy issues every time with the articles that you have, and that is something exceptional. I mean, it's a very good thing to be bringing that debate in. So thank you on our side as well.
Thank you very much.